Hello and welcome. I'm Joshua Johnson, and I'm pleased to invite you and our guest today to the Semantics of Art, a conversation between Diane Bauer and Amanda Beach. In this seminar, the two artists will discuss the significance of language and concepts in their respective practices, and more broadly, the importance of conceptual criteria for art, the deficits of contemporary art's conceptual positions, and the implications of rationalist and accelerationist thought for the future of art. Diane Bauer studied art and architecture at Cooper Union and Goldsmiths College. Her work deploys a language of visual force across disciplines, including drawing, sculpture, painting, printmaking, installation, architecture, and video. Bauer's work has been exhibited in institutions, art galleries, and other non-traditional gathering places internationally since the early 1990s, notably at the ICA, Vilma Gold, the Showroom, the Drawing Room, all in London, as well as Deste Foundation and Benaki Museum in Athens, the Potter Museum of Art Australia, the Busan Biennale in Korea, and White Box, the Dorsky Museum, and Socrates Sculpture Park in New York. This year, she participated in a group show in conjunction with Accelerationism, a symposium on tendencies in capitalism at Kropa Tuscany, Ziedler, Berlin, and I'm sorry if my pronunciation of this stuff is terrible. She was awarded a British Council residency in Hanoi and New Delhi and is an Elephant Trust and Arts Council England Grants Award recipient. Bauer has taught at several institutions, including the Cooper Union and Cornell University, AAP in New York, and Goldsmiths College and the University of Arts in London. Amanda Beach is an artist and writer living in Los Angeles. She currently holds a position of Dean of Critical Studies at Cal Arts, California. She exhibits her artwork at major international venues and regularly publishes writing and contemporary art. Solo shows include Everything Has Led to This Moment at Zero Klein, Coma, London, in 2014, Final Machine, Lanchester Gallery Projects, UK, and Ha Gamley, Prestegard, Norway, both 2013. Sanity Assassin at Spike Island, Bristol, and Tate Britain, all 2010. Statecraft at Harlow, Newtown, in Harlow, UK, in 2008. Final Machine also features an Agitationism at EVA International, the Irish Biennale, and will be seen in L'Avenir, Montreal Biennale, both 2014. She has given recent conference presentations at the Psychopathologies of Cognitive Capitalism, Goldsmiths London, Postplanetary Capitalism, New School, New York, both 2014, and The Flood of Rights, New York. She was a keynote speaker at Generative Constraints, London, in 2013, and exhibiting video in London in 2012. Recent writing includes Concept Without Difference in Art of the Concept in Frigika, 2013, and Exploding Horror, an Abesis Intellectualist Speculative Horror by Merv Verline in Berlin. Both have collaborated on projects including Let Us Pray for Those Now Residing in Designated Area as part of Harlow, Newtown, and showing at DNA Gallery, Berlin, 2009, along with Roman Vasseur. Predators and Pest, 2010, a 3-screen video installation at Low B Gallery, Berlin, and You Are Propelled Forward by the Vacuum in Front of You as part of Tegal, Speculations and Propositions, at Babylon Cinema in 2012, along with a publication by the same name, from the Green Box Press in 2013. I will be moderating the conversation today. I'm a New York-based artist and writer with an interest in the intersections of art, phenomenology, science, technology, post-capitalist constructivism, and post-Kantian philosophy. I've recently shown at Parallel Art Space New York, Louis B. James, New York, and Bureau, New York in 2013. In 2013, I organized and edited Dark Trajectories, Politics of the Outside, a volume of philosophy with contributions from Reza Nagarestani, Benjamin Noyes, Nick Snarnichek, and Alex Williams, amongst others. This event is a part of the Fixing the Future, a New York-based platform designed to provide perspectives for thinking and practicing the future as an imperative. It is organized by Diane Bauer, who is now joining us on the platform, Suhail Malik, Mohammed Salami, Keith Tilford, and myself. We will be doing multiple events throughout the summer, including online seminars like this one, live conferences, and exhibitions to examine what it means to act according to the future. Our website and information about future events is located at fixingthefuture.info. Okay, so I think we can get into it a little bit more, and I have a sort of initial kind of prompt to start you guys off. And I just want to thank both of you for being here with us today, Diane and Amanda. And I guess I just kind of want to start a little bit talking about your work. Text features prominently in both your works. I was hoping to speak a bit to this portion of your respective practices, both to ground the discussion and as a way of opening the conversation into more general concerns. Amanda, your work, and prominently your video installation work, often features text with a variety of representational techniques. Sanity Assassin, for instance, features a combination of flashing imagery interspersed and overlaid with text, continuous and overlapping narratives, staccato bursts of noise, and other sounds, an examination of the corporate wasteland and the givenness of nature. Diane, your work often consists of overlapping and planar textual elements, stacked and cutting across one another, and interrupted by geometric elements. Your recent public installation, Apollo Me Icarus, features what appear to be a number of contradictory political slogans and messages covering the variously oriented planar surfaces of an architectural, sculptural structure based upon a modernist project. Both of these works use text as an element in interrogating forms to construct our experience. This seems clear in Diane's use of the text in relation to one another, but also in regards to the very structure which supports them. While in Amanda's work, the constantly overlapping media, textual, and other elements seem to intercut and ram into one another. There's a kind of maximalism in both works, which seems to build upon smaller elements, stacking and screwing them into one another to achieve an explosive and combustible force that turns any single element into mere shrapnel. But it also builds into a larger experience. So here, I think it's worth discussing how text operates for the both of you and in what way it operates in these works. Well, I see, quote, text as a concrete and reified form of language, a part of discourse that is stilled and factualized into an existing statement. Quote, language seems to be the dynamical and shifting system that operates within a structure to develop discourse. I was hoping we could look at this distinction between text and language and maybe think a bit about how text as an artifact becomes a part of the various forms of mediation you both engage to develop distinct visual languages and how it operates as a part of your conceptual framework. So I think I'm going to let Amanda respond to this first. Take it away. Jason, can we switch to Amanda?
Okay, is that working?
Yeah.
Hi, is that working?
Yeah, we see you.
Okay, great. I just want to say thanks for the invite, and also it's a pleasure to share the platform with Diane, who, as you said, we've worked together on some projects but rarely talked in public. So this is quite an experiment, and it's a great one. So it's a pleasure to be invited. I think your first question is incredibly complex, and it relates to a whole set of, let's say, presuppositions and standards that have been inherited in contemporary art, and I think it also means that we have to maybe think about some analytical language philosophy here as well at a certain point. I guess what I'm interested in, to try and get to your question about the collapse, compression, or crash of different language forms in my work, and you mentioned Sanity Assassin. I think what was really important to that piece in particular, and this is what I mean about the standard element of it, because it's not new to art to be interested in this, and that is the idea of text as live performative data, but also text as something that is an image. And there's often a kind of also an attempt to produce a tension between those readings of what text is, whether it's dynamic in its own performativity, and then it's also an image, so therefore it has kind of figural content, right? So I didn't want to go about using text as a point of tension between these two readings of text, if you like, and instead what I wanted to use and appeal to text for was precisely the fact that we sometimes imagine that when we read, it is more direct, it's less mediated or unmediated stuff that we're looking at. It kind of has a materiality. But at the same time, what's interesting about text for me is that it's delivered. It's a delivery of a concept in its action, and to kind of pull those different readings together in one site or one experience is really important for me. But what's equally important is how the text in my work operates, hopefully at an egalitarian level with other imagery. And I don't just mean the quality of the text as image, but the other imagery that comes into the video. And this compression of all layers of imagery, if you like, that are kind of used with the text, I like to think of how they're kind of, it's a kind of maybe a site of destruction, if you like, in that operation. But I'm interested in how the site of that violence or the forces of those systems being treated more equally, if you like, don't just disperse the media and don't undermine it, but actually coagulate and produce a kind of sense of direction or drive. So within the frame as a whole, with everything that is included in that frame, including whether it's noise, sound, whatever you want to call it, imagery plus text, text as image, image as text, all of these things are produced as, I guess, one form of picturing that's seen as one picture. And in many ways, I've referred to my video work as painting, and I mean, I could also refer to it as sculpture, as of course I can, and I do install the works very sculpturally. But in terms of the image making procedure, I like to think that when I stop a video and I look at a still, it's configured as if I would a picture, a painted picture. And I think that's really important in terms of how the image operates as a system of language. So text for me, just to try and explain, text isn't, it's normatively kind of considered to be the element of propaganda, the element of drive, the thing that tells you what to do, the pedagogic, didactic moment. But what I want to consider in the work is how text is just one element of that. And also it allows me to kind of uncover the myths of neutrality around imagery, other imagery, the myth of action around text, and the myth of inaction or passivity around, say, a screensaver. Okay, so I wanted to look at, and this is where we get maybe to a bit of kind of thinking through some reading of analytical philosophy that destroys those hierarchies between action and figure. I think this is something that really drives me to kind of still use text, because of course it calls upon those elements of propaganda, but to collapse all of that into one system of power. So I hope that kind of makes a little bit of sense.
I think that's very interesting. I'm kind of thinking a bit in regards to this kind of collapse or building on these foundations, maybe about Labus Wood's work and his kind of building in the ruins of war and sort of in the ruins of existing systems. And I guess maybe we'll pass it over to Diane now and see what her response is, and maybe she could play off of that a little bit too.
Yeah, I mean, I hadn't really thought about it in terms of Levius's work, and I wouldn't mind talking about that a bit further. Although, I mean, just briefly to, I guess, summarize my move to using text. It actually initially was with this attempt. It's going to echo a bit of what Amanda says, but kind of coming at it from the other side, in that I moved to using text in an attempt to be clearer and more didactic, because the way my work was being spoken about was about art history, and I'm not particularly interested in art history, and I'm more interested in power and violence, and so I was like, okay, how can I be clearer about what it is that I'm actually interested in? And so, I mean, I've been using it for a number of years now, and of course, obviously it became very clear to me quite quickly that the a text doesn't just operate in terms of what it says. Obviously, as Amanda was saying, it is it's one element of language within it. I mean, with the Apollo, Icarus meet Apollo piece, I mean, it's based on a modernist architectural folly that called the Apollo Pavilion, named after the space missions. It was said by Victor Passmore, who made it. It was supposed to be a free, autonomous monument because of its independence, can lift the activity and psychology of urban housing community to a universal plane. And I think that there was something in this optimism of what humans can be that appealed to me. But what ended up happening with the original Apollo Pavilion was that it became derelict very quickly. It was a place to basically smoke weed, and people would pee in the corners, and it stank, and it sort of just became this sort of broken hulk of a thing. So it was this combination of dealing with sort of the reality of what humans are, and then what we aspire to, and those two things crashing into each other. So I've got, I mean, one language that was very strong in that piece was actually the fact that it's using this modernist language of form, a formal language rather than verbal language, and then laid on top of it this verbal language, like the text that I took from all over the places, and then broke up visually. And so the whole thing sort of functions like a visual puzzle of sorts. And then also the fact that it was a public piece, and it's where and how it existed in real space, in real time, was this piece in a park that kids would climb all over, and it became this place of play. So then that sort of is an additional language to it. So I think my use of language, or my move to text, I suppose, it originally was an attempt to be clearer. Like, I feel like I'm always trying to be clearer with what I'm doing, and sort of get to the point in the clearest way that I can. And I'm constantly foiled because it's this multiplication of languages. And actually, I think that I'm getting to a point now where I want to use that multiplication of language, not to in any way espouse indeterminacy, but to use it as a place to say many different things with force at the same time, in a way that verbal language alone does not have available to it.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's something that you both brought up that you're kind of working with very sort of disparate materials, not just text, but other forms of mediation, whether they be sculptural or video. And I guess I'm kind of curious, maybe in this sort of distinction I was attempting to draw between text and language is how these sort of fragments get combined into something that in itself kind of makes a complete statement in another way. So it's like working with these various ruins to build a kind of different sort of discourse for maybe what was even intended by the sort of fragments that you're pulling together. And I was hoping maybe you both could discuss that for a bit. I don't know if, Amanda, you want to respond to that initially?
Okay, I'll just say something maybe quickly, that what I'm trying to describe here is well, okay, to be clear, let me try and be clear about this, that rather than have an internal conversation within the frame, like a dialectical conversation, where the artist might speak of the tension between image text, text image, or language text, text language, which is so often done in art, and that's also art that plays on that dualism between the real and the representational within its own construction. So I think of Jeff Wall, for example, right? So his work is really interested in operating at that tension of the constructed and the real. So producing those tensions to me are just basically kind of superficial or cosmetic, and they don't really understand the way language operates, as according to how I think it. So what I was trying to think about and also communicate then in the last kind of round was how how within a single frame, within the frame of the image, i.e. the artwork that I propose, there is a kind of synthesis of forces. Now, that synthesis comes about through the treatment of languages, different registers of language, as being non-hierarchical. Now, we know that there are standard hierarchies in language. We appreciate some forms of reality as being more true, language as being more true than others, as being more real than others. But I'm interested in what would it mean to approach language in an egalitarian sense. And coming from that, i.e. these different kind of modalities of speech or imagery or sound, what would it be to treat the content and the form of those as somehow equivalent? Again, you know, this is not a new approach to thinking about language in art, but what I think I'm really trying to move towards here is how they do synthesize in a really coherent and possibly dogmatic format, which I'm not worried about at all. And I think, just like Diane was saying, that idea of clarity and coherence is really crucial to the work. And that doesn't mean that the work shies away from abstraction. And if anyone has seen my work, they'll know that I'm not afraid of abstraction. Most of it is really kind of, I don't know, it doesn't simply say, do this, do that. This is the way things should be, although it does have a little bit of that in it. I think that it's more interested in trying to think about how the whole kind of package or the totalized experience of the work operates with a sense of force that has a particular direction and drive, as I said before. And I don't necessarily think that means that the work has a single aim in mind. Like, for example, it will teach the audience to be nicer to each other, for example. You know, it could have that intention, but that's not it.
Dan, you want to speak to that a little bit more?
No, I just the thought of someone coming away from one of Amanda's installations thinking, oh, now I know how to be nice. If you have any familiarity with her work, it sort of feels, I don't know, nothing. That's all. No, I can carry on. I didn't mean to interrupt you mid-flow.
No, let's switch up again and see. I mean, maybe you want to speak a little bit about, I don't know, how about these hierarchical relationships between the elements, or even maybe a little bit more towards the kind of didacticism or dogmatic attitude.
Well, I think, I mean, for me, I think I would like the work to be clear, but I also would like it to be complicated. So that immediately presents a problem. I mean, it's like immediately setting a really high bar and difficult task. Because with verbal language, you can say something and then you can clarify it, and you use a lot of words to do that. But when you're making a piece that has, where you're dissolving the hierarchy of language, like you don't have verbal language above visual language, where you're trying to synthesize them, you can't really do that in the same way. You can't, I mean, because it would just be boring. I mean, it would just really be, it's like if you're going to operate in that way, you should, you know, write a text. You know, it's like if you're trying to do it visually, that dissolve of that hierarchy needs to be there. Otherwise, there's no reason to do it as a visual thing. So for me, the drive of making work is very much, I want to see what this thing is going to look like, because I usually don't know when I start, and it's that force is the thing that propels the actual making of the object. And in a way, the text needs to be made as succinct as possible to try and get at what you're interested in terms of its content. But as you know, I think it's this thing of like dissolving any hierarchy of language is really crucial if you're going to have a work function, I guess, in the way that I would want it to, and I think the way Amanda wants her work to, which is with force, which is you know, not for me anyways, like, you know, I'm not interested in making particularly polite discursive work. I want it to have more force than that.
Okay. So I think we should switch up to another kind of question here. I mean, I think there's something very kind of interesting you both are bringing up in regards to the kind of material, I guess, flatness within the work itself, but then in terms of its kind of like interpretation or its reception, I feel like there's a sort of division there in that you kind of have a very definitive direction according to how you want to kind of direct maybe the sort of criteria of reception for the work itself, even though you're kind of on a production level, you're kind of smashing these things down to their material base. So I guess I'd like to maybe move to this next session, and maybe some of those issues will come up again in this. But I guess let's speak a bit more about contemporary art and think about it as a system. I mean, I know you both write and lecture on the politics of art, amongst other issues, and contemporary art as a name for a particular discourse of art that's dominated the beginning of the 21st century, is distinct from past modes of artistic production and dissemination. While modern art championed a succession of avant-gardist practice which historically supplanted previous movements, building upon and judging the statements made by previous artworks, contemporary art denies any notion of progress, preferring the endless proliferation of differences without criteria for their judgment, leading to an interminable extension of its own domain. Clearly, I'm framing this as a problem, for without standards of judgment, it seems we cannot make value judgments about art and have no means of linking the concepts we espouse about an artwork to the artwork, and make determinate claims about its representative capacity, thus denying its ability to contribute or enable any positive political project. Furthermore, what value decisions are made in contemporary art seem to be outsourced to the market, which adds to any other criteria, values art in its privatized and quantifiable terms. I was hoping then you might be able to speak a bit about this system of contemporary art and its aporias, both as regards its conceptual framework and its interpenetration with capitalism. How does this affect artistic production and its discourse? And then maybe Diane, you want to pick up with that to begin with?
Sure. I'm kind of on board with the contemporary art is a lost cause shtick. I think contemporary art as a field resembles too closely exactly the thing many of us are trying to dismantle. I'm not particularly interested in dismantling contemporary art as such. It's not really the project I want to take on, because I think there's an infrastructure within art that is worth using. I think it's worth. There's a lot of interest in art for. I may be jumping ahead here. In accelerationism, in the progression of a new left, and so there is infrastructural support for that project coming from the art and culture sector. It provides venues, it provides money for talks, this sort of thing. So that, I think, is worth using, but not in bad faith. I think it's in the interest of those of us trying to rethink this stuff to also rethink what art can be, and try to remake it, I suppose. I think I'll start with that, because I think this is something I personally want to and need to flesh out in conversation.
Okay.
I'm starting to think through.
Amanda, you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, thanks for the question. And I think what you've outlined is something that a lot of us, a lot of people have been trying to describe as a problem, you know, the condition of contemporary art, the condition of art as we know it, and art as we've lived it, and art as we determine it as limited. And you know, as we know that a lot of people also have written for a long time, since the late 60s, I guess, around the limits of art, the limits of contemporary art as being precisely the value of contemporary art. Yeah. So there's this idea where failure has become the very condition of critique. So, you know, there's been so many books and anthologies on this, so many practices that deal with it, and art defines itself as a tragic discourse, and importantly, it is a discourse to these people who define it as tragic. And I guess I want to think about art that isn't really involved in kind of discourse or the genre of discourse itself, and that can move away from the very idea that art should be a kind of open dialogical or discursive framework. I try in my work very much to practice that and live it out, and whether it succeeds or not, that's another thing, but that's in a kind of attempt directly in the practice to do that. And I also think, you know, that we have to think about the role of modernity here and how we understand it. And, you know, I have lots of questions to myself about this, like, is it important how we understand the problem itself? Because we know the project of describing a problem can also be the manufacturing of a false kind of foundational enemy itself. And so I have that as a question. But I guess what I've been interested in doing for quite a long time, or it's kind of embedded in my thinking, I guess, over the years of following or believing certain things and then finding them to be limited myself, is that, you know, that we get these projects in modernity, like the Adornian project of negative dialectics, and where there's a kind of ambiguation of the image. And he talks about, Adorno talks in that essay Commitment about the machine angel, about this kind of image of ambiguity that is the very center of the task of arts politics. And then we get in Deleuze this kind of idea that, and Guattari, this idea of the modern artwork being retrieved to rescue a kind of politics without end, where there's a kind of collapse of the registers of subjectivity and objectivity. There's a kind of collage together of these kind of identities into more, what I'd say is a kind of nature space. And I think whether you're looking at negative dialectics or Deleuze and Guattari, or even like Rancière's third way politics of art, you get these attempts to produce areas and territories of dispersion and antagonism. And I think that what we've seen is that these are very located in a particular aesthetics by art itself and by thought, by the people who think it. And they become quite ideologically sound, if you like. And they're easily, despite their kind of modern character, they're easily kind of, let's say, brought into the language of capital. They don't resist capital. And I think that what we have often seen is that despite all these attempts to think about aporia, ambiguity, dispersion, violence, rupture, all of these words that we're kind of familiar with in the history of art, at the end of the day, unfortunately, whatever their kind of conceptual rigor or thinking was, we get these kind of narratives of the different, the perceptually different, the new, the author, and all of these narratives that kind of fix these theories or concepts and frame them. So I think that, unfortunately, these modern projects of aporia and ambiguation and all these kind of projects of dispersal cannot fight or combat with the kind of more rhetorically forceful languages from capitalism and neoliberalism, which are difference, i.e. at the perceptual level, like invention, is it new, is it different? and who did it, like the author, and the desiring kind of nature of the author as this kind of highly individuated producer of the new. So I think that those modern projects don't help themselves because they don't have any aim. Their aim is emancipation, but that emancipation doesn't have a particularity. It's a kind of opening up. It's about producing a more open field, whilst at the same time it's contradictory because they say the image is already open. So on the one hand, the image is already... Sorry, that's my dog. So on the one hand, the image
has a lot to say.
Yeah, it's not me trying to make an artwork or something. Antagonize myself. But yeah, on the one hand, you know, there's this kind of always already idea of the image is open and the artwork kind of coalesces with this nature, and then the artwork, of course, the task of it is to realize this, and it becomes an emancipatory project because it realizes its openness within the ground of politics. And I think that that's a myth. It doesn't operate. It's impractical and it's illogical, and it leaves us standing in the kind of framework of capital and its kind of jurisdiction on these forms of identity rather than these forms of politics.
All right. Well, I was hoping
Diane, characterizing my complaint there with contemporary art, with the problems of modernity and also what hopes we can have for a kind of modernity now.
Yeah.
I just want to come in with something that I was in thinking about this. I feel like there's a real equivalence, I suppose. I mean, this thing of contemporary art can be anything. This sort of lack of sort of unbounded fields of contemporary art that, you know, is, as long as it's in a gallery, it can be anything. And this is, you know, back to Duchamp, I suppose. It's also something that capitalism does, you know. I mean, it can subsume anything, and so this is why I think art is a useful node or place for research and how to deal with this as a problem. In part because it's a somewhat receptive field, you know. But I think because of the parallel of these problems or these conditions, I think it perhaps is where research can be useful in art. I mean, I think for a long time I'm jumping ahead a little bit here because I think I'm wanting to get to
the acceleration stuff and everything. Yeah. Maybe you could, I mean, if you guys want to kind of discuss a little bit more, maybe solutions and that sort of thing, I do think there's maybe a little bit more to say. I mean, Amanda kind of already hit upon this a bit, but the kind of the complicity of art with money and capitalism. I guess I was wondering maybe if you had anything else to add to that, Diane, or...
The complicity of art and money, gosh. In a way, part of me is like, no, I have nothing to, to add to that, but also I feel like I could go on for ages about that. The immediate thing that comes to mind is it takes some money to support artists. You know, I mean, there is a basic principle, and I think a lot of us have other jobs to support our practices, and then there's like the issue of venues and actually I think I'd rather skip ahead because I think it'll come back to this. I don't know that I have anything.
Yeah, no, I think the problem of production in arts is a big one, especially given the kind of systems it's already sort of imbricated with, and maybe we could talk, I guess, a little bit about these kind of politics and potential solutions to them when we discuss this next session. But I guess I just want to say, I mean, you both have been deeply engaged in and contributed discussions surrounding the new rationalism and accelerationism. And in addition to various writings, lectures, and other projects you both produced, In respect to this thought, I mean, you, Diane, have recently contributed a series of drawings to the Accelerate Reader, while Amanda's Final Machine book had contributions from Robin McKay and Resna Garastani. Accelerationism sort of desires a hegemonic political transformation across different social and political structures, while rationalism encourages a reformation of the conceptual structure of thought that will unite it according to universalized epistemology. I think contemporary art seems resistant to both of these strains of thought and preferring both an empty autonomy for the proper name of art, which was kind of Pace Suhel's reading of contemporary art, while also denying any sort of universal criteria for its judgment. Given these issues that have been raised in regards to contemporary art, do you see these modes of thought as offering new ways for thinking about art, or restructuring its discourse to move us away from some of the more troubling aspects of contemporary art, both as a part of a larger political project from outside, maybe this sort of hegemonic project of a larger politics that might help art escape the limits of capitalism which functionally interpenetrate it, and from inside art in terms of the kind of conceptual framework which now structures production and reception of art? How might they affect this transformation? And then I guess I'll go to you, Amanda, for this first, and then back to Diane after that.
Thank you. That is a really complicated question as well, and I just been trying to make notes and think about it, and I have a few questions, and I don't know the answers to them, and I don't know who does, but I wonder about what you call the dominance of capitalism and a possible escape from it, and I wonder about that because what is our problem with capitalism? You know, is it money, or is it the principles in which enables the which support it, which is the kind of accumulation of more, you know, according to desire and subjective desire at that. So what would it be to operate within a system that produces values, which capitalism does, without those principles? And I don't know. I don't know the answer to that, but I really want to keep pressing that and to think about it, because here I am, you know, making art in a system. I have a wage, you know, and I'm not going to point out I'm not going to try and say that's ironic, because I don't think it is, you know, but that I live in a system that I'm not happy with. That's not ironic, that's just a complaint. But I think what you bring up is it really is a challenge, because again, it makes me wonder, how much do we need to diagnose and represent and describe the problem in itself, or the problem of the status quo, as we call it, or the problem of the dominance of these principles? What is it to understand them, and what kind of knowledge do we require to kind of forge that understanding? And is that knowledge in itself a problem? Is it the kind of knowledge that we've been critiquing in the past? And I wonder about that, really, and I wonder about our relation to power and dominance, or what we call normativity. And I think in my practice, like coming back to the practice again, I think when I make my work, I try and act as if it doesn't bear out a specific relation to that form of dominance that we might describe as being, you know, capitalist hegemony. I think when I go to make the work, I don't act that is the case. I act that something else is the case. I behave in a certain way that doesn't, like when we talked before about the kind of attempt to look at an egalitarian idea of like a non-hierarchical language systems. To approach things as if they were the case is really interesting to me, and to convince myself that that's the kind of reality condition of the work. And it is a kind of realism in that sense that I think I'm working through. But I just want to say something, and then I'm sure Diane's got a lot to say about this, but I just want to say that, you know, the privilege of making artwork that affords me the place to act as if another case were in reach, and that this case might be different to the conditions that guide and value contemporary art, puts me in a difficult position. Because this exact place of affordance, that is the place that guarantees and protects my aim to think differently, could simply be read as a form of irony that might be recuperated back into the work by its necessity to be public. So because I need to implicitly call upon the task for art as difference potential to critique the idealism of difference which it opposes, any critical claim might end up only valorizing my private expression in the name of artistic autonomy and art's natural alterity. All those things that I've just really complained about, right? So what I'm describing here is the traditional feedback loop of art and critique. And I'm trying to not think about that feedback loop, because that doesn't help me at all to think about moving in any future direction, because the feedback loop in itself, I think, is it's a kind of form of prophetic arrogance, I guess, that we assume we will always feed back into this problem. So I can't trust it logically that we will. I can't guarantee that that's the case. But I do think it makes me think about art's social function outside of this hand-wringing and self-assessment that art often does for itself. It worries about its own efficacy. So rather than worry about how effective my work's going to be, or how I can measure its effect or affect, or however we want to frame it, I try not to kind of think about all of those principles that are often given to a work of art, even if when I make my work they will be given to it and it will be measured by those terms. So I try and act like that's not the case.
Well, I mean, there is something very interesting you said there in regards to, like, you kind of look at the work as maybe, or when you're starting out, you consider how the world ought to be, maybe not the way that it is. And so you kind of have a vision of this sort of future where these things are possible, rather than the way things are now. And there seems to be a kind of representative or representational license given to art that maybe you don't have in other fields. But I guess maybe, Diane, you want to speak to that a little bit? Or do you
I
have
was just
some
going to
other...
ask Amanda about something. I rather than jump around too much, I just wanted to clarify this thing about what you say. You make work as if something else were the case. What is the something else? How do you mean specifically? I mean, like, do you have a specific something else in mind? Is it what you were saying about it's not going to be held? If you could just clarify that, I guess is what I. Well,
I guess I think a lot about what would it be like to make an artwork in a system that doesn't go to work with the principles that we've been complaining about, right? So, the natural alterity of the image, the idea of subjective autonomy, the idea of a pre-given subject that chooses, these kind of normative paradigms that are, or principles, I should say, that are kind of conducive and associated with the conditions of capitalist power, and also are prevalent in the art system and prevalent in the definitions of how we're looking at contemporary art today. I see all of those terms as being the culprits, if you like, for the kind of weakness of contemporary art in terms of its politics, but also of its ability to produce propositional thinking. So my problem with art as it stands is that it's obsessed with itself, and it assumes that if it measures its own efficacy, then it's done enough to A, be art, and B, be political. And I think it's wrong on both counts, and therefore I would say that work to me isn't art, and I would reclassify art within a different structure and a different system. And that sounds very arrogant, but I think that's, again, what the work affords me to do. The work almost compels me to say that because of its aim. So the idea you're asking me, rather than, I think, Diane, you're trying to ask me, like, rather than say, what are you against? I think you're asking me, well, what are you for? And what I'm trying to think about in that positive, let's say, assertive critique, whatever that might be, or constructive critique would be, well, what I'm trying to look at is what would be a kind of realist practice or a materialist practice. What is it to understand the conditions of my communication as being based on a realism? And I think that idea is the kind of basic kind of linchpin of my practice. So I'm not talking about here like political aims or political content, but by rights of producing what I call a realist or materialist practice, I'd want to kind of disclose what another politics could be through that. And I don't know what that is or could be as yet.
Hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think my initial response to this was, I mean, in relation to the development of a new left, was not really so much what can it bring to art, but can art in fact bring anything to it? I think was sort of how I approached it, because, you know, reading a lot of the writing that's been happening in the last sort of year or two, the Accelerationist Manifesto, as an example, seems to sort of lay out, I think, the most convincing step towards something viable, which seems a very exciting and project that is worth investing in. And I think my initial approach to it was is more something like, okay, I am a practitioner. You know, I am involved in this hugely problematic field if you're trying to maintain a leftist politics. Is there any way to rethink that? Think what I do, and is there anything that can bring to the further development of these ideas of a new left? And I think I'm trying to think about making work more collaboratively and cross-disciplinarily, and through just those conversations that are starting to happen, I am seeing these equivalences that I referred to a little bit before of this problem of, capitalism happily subsuming everything, and contemporary art doing the same, and it feels like a trap. And how do you find your way out of this trap? And I guess that's where looking at this new leftist thinking is useful for me, possibly, and trying to at least begin to think my way out of this. Now, if I can even get to the point where I can think my way out of it, it might be another step altogether to make work out of it. Out of it, I mean out of that system. I'm still not sure how that's going to happen, because I'm interested in making big, immersive, ambitious work. I'm not really interested in making small, polite things that hang on a wall. I mean, I do, but I mean, it's I don't want to. I don't want to approach making work as like, okay, well, if I make work that doesn't suit the market or does suit the market, then it'll be this or that. I think I'm not sure where this is going to go or how it's going to play out, but I think I don't know. I suppose I'm thinking of it as a very long-term research project,
well,
and I don't know what the outcome is going to be.
If I could, just for a moment, I think that one of the things in regards to accelerationism is its sort of, move towards hegemony and the kind of transformation of multiple domains of knowledge across the spectrum. And, it seems to want to mobilize different sorts of practice towards the same end. And I think you've spoken in the past about kind of the limits that the capitalist marketplace and the way that it interfaces with the art marketplace puts upon artistic production and the ways that we kind of consider our practice. I guess I'm wondering if either of you have anything perhaps to say to that, or and maybe the kind of influence or the sort of ways in which accelerationism might offer solutions even from outside art for these kind of limits. I mean, I guess is the practice of art from inside the same as the kind of sort of political transformations that accelerationism is calling for from maybe the outside?
Can you say that last bit again?
I say is the sort of the sort of transformation accelerationism is calling for, is it the same as maybe just a transformation in artistic practice in itself, or is it maybe a kind of reconsideration of the sort of politics that surround practice? You know, so I think there's a bit of an inside-outside difference going on here, and you know, either you or Amanda could speak to this, or maybe you could both speak to it for a little bit.
If I could just say a brief answer is I think it has to be both, and I'll turn it over to Amanda. And that's, I mean, I can go on if you, but I feel like I've been blowing on for a bit, so.
Go ahead if you want to say something more.
It's okay, go ahead.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I think that I find the question of real practical systematic change. You know, this is what you're kind of entertaining the talk of, rather than I guess the writing of change, the thinking of change, and the producing images that project change. And I know that what we're talking about is how all those things can coalesce, or how they play into each other. I think, you know, it's an incredibly, when I think about accelerationism, which I know not enough about to really speak of formally, but one of the things that I do worry about is, as I said before, is what kind of knowledge is being purchased here, and how are we understanding the kind of mastery that's kind of required to produce other forms. And I also wonder how that power has been figured is in a kind of traditional avant-gardist sense, in terms of a kind of nostalgic idea of change. And so I have some kind of concerns about accelerationism in terms of its avant-gardism. And that's not to say that I'm not interested in projects, because I am interested in thinking about what can be done, rather than, like, say, having this anxious hand-wringing about what can we do, you know. So I am interested in kind of actual action, but I guess I wouldn't continue to make work if I didn't believe that somehow my artwork demanded something different enough from the context in which it operated that would produce certain different forms of thought, right? Now, in that sense, the artwork acts as some kind of form of rhetorical or propagandist element for my thinking, and hopefully for other people's thinking too. And that's perhaps where the kind of collective element is required, because I think that a collective mobilized project is necessary if we want to think about real systematic change, and it has to go much further than the kind of representational features of the art world, but it doesn't mean that they're not counted either, or they're not important. So, like I say, I mean, I wouldn't make my work, I think, I wouldn't continue to be an artist if I didn't have some conviction that images mattered. Even images that are kind of often framed and structured by these really dominant and constraining conditions of power that we've identified.
Do you have anything else to say to that, Diane? And then I think we'll go maybe to some questions here.
Well, one thing that occurred to me a bit earlier, and it is jumping back to, you mentioned Lebbeus Woods. I was something I mean, I wonder if architecture is an interesting place to try and look at this as well. Because it always struck me as very difficult to be of the left and to be an architect because of the structures involved in getting anything built. Or, you know, so he seems like a interesting example of, I suppose, a way to operate. I mean, that said, he didn't actually build a heck of a lot, but he ended up, I suppose, being in art venues more than architecture venues. But I think his practice is one worth looking at as a place to sort of think through some of this stuff. How to think a leftist politics while operating within a problematic infrastructure of culture industry, I guess.
Well, yeah, no, it's very hard, I think, to consider how to move forward with the sort of constraints of the present circumstances, and maybe to build something new without simply following this sort of existing structure. And I think you both have kind of, highlighted aspects of that. Mo has kind of got a question here, so I think we're going to go to a question from Mo. I'm not sure if he's going to simply pop in here since he's on the chat.
Yes, hi. Can you see me?
Yeah.
Hello. Yes, I've been watching and also kind of monitoring YouTube to make sure that like the live feed is also like okay and all that. So I had a question. It mostly sort of is from Diane, and I managed to get my copy of the Accelerate Reader yesterday, and it was my first chance to see how others are viewing your the four artworks that Robin has used to sort of like introduce each section of the book, right? And I'm just gonna like show couple of them in the monitor because it sort of like deals with text. You guys are talking about text. That's first one. They're like different, but they get more complex, I guess, right, as we move to sections. But my question was sort of like, how did you reconcile sort of like seeing your work? Because you talked about text, right? Meaning text in the artwork, but also here we see your work being used alongside some like major like text. Like this is all text, very like fine type too. I have to like buy like a reading glass to read it actually, because it's like types are really smart. And how do you feel about the way your work was utilized to sort of like not illustrate, but kind of like basically like how do you see it? Are you happy with the way this project worked out for you, or you see some sort of like improvement next time you want to like work like this? I just had like question. These are actually questions I also had from Keith Tilford, because I think Nick and Alex used one of his artwork for one of the posters of one of their academic gatherings in England, where like they took an image of Keith and they put it in the background of the poster and just like put some typeface on top of it to announce the academic, and the poster looked fabulous and like the artwork was fabulous. But again, I had the same question of like the way not just images but artwork by artists who are consider themselves conceptual subjects is being utilized in sort of like the accelerationist, more political process. And I have an example for that actually that might help. I was researching the famous like constructivist exhibition in Moscow in June of 1921, and then I figured out and I kind of like found out that the show was actually that included all the like beautiful, wonderful sculptures of Rodchenko and those very famous pieces. Some of them are at the MoMA. But the exhibition actually was open to coincide with the Third Congress of the Comintern, or the International Communist Conference in Moscow. So even though the work was all constructivist and almost had no element of like social realism or communism in it, but the coinciding kind of like made it part of that larger communist gathering, which actually, if you research, was the one in which social democrats and socialists were excluded from the communist movement, and they were told like, make up your mind, You're either going to work with bourgeoisie or not. And sort of like the artwork kind of went with this sort of like bold political gathering.
I can't speak much to that latter example, but I'm very, I mean, specifically within the context of the book, I'm very happy with it. The work, I mean, the works were developed for the book, and in a way it was as, I'm pretty relaxed about design, art, you know, blurring of lines. In a way, I treated it as like a brief in a way, and I worked with Robin on what images would work and what images weren't. And I actually found the conversation I had with him really interesting and really productive in terms of trying to think about what they needed to look like. You know, I did one that looked sort of referenced futurism too much, and we decided that we could not use this language again. I mean, this visual language was not appropriate because, I mean, pointedly, you don't want accelerationism to look like futurism. I mean, it's a very different political project, and there's an inclination, I think, or there will be an inclination, sort of hearing a term like accelerationism, and if you see this sort of zingy, like futurist-looking image, those equivalencies are going to be made in people's heads, and it's important that they're not. So, actually working on it sort of as a design brief, I suppose, I found it really useful as a way to make drawings. I don't know that I necessarily consider them an artwork or a drawing or what, and I don't really mind. I don't really care. In terms of you know, using Keith's work, I obviously I wouldn't attempt to speak for Keith, but if it were me, I'd be perfectly happy with it. I mean, in a way, it sort of goes back to what I was saying before, is not, you know, what can accelerationism bring to the thinking of art, but kind of the other way around. I mean, if there's some way that it can be practically utilized, I'm perfectly happy to contribute to that. I would enthusiastically contribute to that.
I'm going to ask the second part of my question from Amanda, which was basically, how do you avoid seeing your attempt to make work that is politically not meaningful, but work that has political implications, to fall into sort of like a socialist realist model? You know, I'm still going with that Russian thing because we know what happened after, like, communists took over the whole socialist movement and all that. So how do you sort of like, and then I asked this question from Suhail in my introduction to curatorial class, and he gave like the most incredible answer to the question. But he, at the same time, he said not many artists out there are actually doing this. So it's very easy to see the kind of art that we advocate, kind of like bordering social realism, but actually there's a way for it to not to. So I just want to see, how do you see this? You know, how do you avoid sort of like that didactic way that, you know, political art usually gets wrapped into? And that's it, my question. There's lots of questions on the sidebar that I think Joshua can like ask them after it.
Well, just very quickly to that, Mo. I think that there is a huge distinction to be made between a social realist art and a realist art, and it's something I'm really, you know, invested in making that distinction. And you know, there's been a lot of work on talking and writing around art, and also making art that also tries to make that distinction. And I think one of the problems of an art that might call itself like realist or materialist, in kind of like, let's say, look at the history of art, is that it tends to rely upon certain idealisms of the image itself, and these often pull it back into a social realist art rather than what I might call realist or materialist kind of form of production. So, and you know, I also think of Jean-Francois Lyotard's, you know, very famous text about the difference between his version of the real sublime through the processional and the idea of a social realist art that simply supports the status quo. And whilst I don't vouch for his solution, I do think his diagnosis of social realism is key there. So, I think it's something that is about a misunderstanding by people who think and make or practice as people often confuse realism with social realism, and they're really different. That's all I have to say, I guess.
I'm going to ask another question from Victoria Ivanova, if I said her name properly, I hope. It seems that the idea of using the infrastructure of contemporary art to rethink art has caught on. Yet shouldn't aims be more clearly defined if this isn't to turn into yet another rethinking fad very much in line with the current contemporary art condition? And I don't know if, Diane, you want to field that first, and then maybe we can get Amanda's response?
Yes. Is that sufficient as an answer? Say the first part again.
It seems that the idea of using the infrastructure of contemporary art to rethink art has caught on.
Yeah.
Yet shouldn't aims be more clearly defined if this isn't to turn into yet another rethinking fad very much in line with the current contemporary art condition?
Yeah, I think that's a really fair point. But this is where I think work being done in other fields can hopefully be useful.
Thinking fad very much in line with the current contemporary art condition. And I'm getting a bit of Amanda's response. Are we getting a bit of feedback from somebody here?
Yeah. Is that sufficient as an answer?
Hi, is it working?
Say the first part again. I'm doing that
the idea of using the infrastructure of contemporary art to rethink art has caught on.
Yeah.
Yet aims be more clearly defined if this isn't to turn into yet another rethinking fad very much in line with the current contemporary art condition.
Yeah, I think that's a really fair point. But this is where I think.
Hello?
Hi. Okay.
Okay, so sorry, a bit of technical.
In real time?
I think so.
All right. I totally lost the train of what I was saying. Amanda, were you about to say something, or was that feedback?
No, it wasn't me, but I can say something. But I'll just kind of maybe repeat something I was trying to say earlier, because maybe it didn't come across very clearly. But when we were talking about accelerationism, and we were talking about knowledge. I was talking about knowledge, and I was also a bit worried about whether we needed to diagnose the problem of contemporary art as a means to produce an alternative or other form. And what I was trying to say there was that I'm not that convinced by that position that aims to produce a kind of rationalization of the problem in order to rely upon that as assisting with a solution. I think it's kind of generative in some senses for me as an artist to say these are all the things that I think are wrong with contemporary art, or art as I know it. And these are the problems historically of art's attempt to be political, and this is why it might have failed. But I don't, as I was saying before, I don't rest the case of my practice on the conditions of what I see to be those failures. The root of my practice comes out of an attempt to think another case. My other case does not rely upon the normative case that I've described, right? And I think that's really important, because I'm not interested in producing a dualism or a kind of dialectical tension between my work and the normative, let's say. And I talked about that before, about this kind of compression of the image within a frame that produces direction, that there's not enough room for, or there's not enough liberation, let's say, or there's no space for that choice in the work to make a distinction between good and evil in that sense, or the free and the unfree. I don't want to really, I'm not really interested in my artwork playing those games. And in many ways, what I see to be driving my practice is whether I'll be proven wrong or not by someone more informed than me telling me, is that I see a kind of impetus of my practice being around logic the logic of the actual communication of the image itself and what I'm saying. So I guess I agree with that person. Is it Victoria who asked that question? That that this kind of reflex upon the normative to me is as I said with the accelerations problem, if I understand it correctly, it risks producing kind of nostalgia in its own making, and it enjoys the condition of what it defines as a trap too much, and it also seems to understand the trap too well. And I worry about those forms of knowledge that understand the conditions of their constraint that much. So I'm not quite sure about those positions, or even whether I've understood them correctly to be complaining about them.
But I don't know that it's necessarily defining conditions of constraint. I think that's sort of why it seems like something else. It's sort of taking the conditions and using them for something that is previously been seen as constraint, and repurposing them. So it's not necessarily about where the restrictions are. I mean, I'm thinking about Victoria's question a bit more too. I mean, I take the point that if you're still using the infrastructure of contemporary art, if you're still using the sorry, my phone's going. If you're still using the infrastructure of contemporary art, I'm sorry, this is totally distracting. I lost my track. I'm sorry, I've got to turn this.
If you're using the infrastructure of contemporary art, how do you move beyond it, or?
No, I mean, if it's okay. So if you're still going to use it, and use sort of a system that's in place. I don't know that I'm necessarily advocating to use a system that's in place. It just seems that there is, I'm not sure what else to use. I mean, because if you use things like, I mean, if you do something that is outside of art, contemporary art being where we're at, I think, and is how art generally is perceived now, would fall in, like, in a gallery system, in a museum, in context that would be considered art, and by most that are not necessarily involved in the conversation of getting rid of contemporary art and avowing art, would be considered contemporary art, if you see what I mean. So say you do something, you say, I'm just producing visual culture. It will get slotted into something. Like, if it'll get slotted into gaming, or it'll get slotted into PR, or it'll get slotted into something. So I'm reluctant to abandon the word art, and this is a conversation that, or a debate that I find myself in often, and I think for me, I think it's worth hanging on to the word art as a term. And sort of claim it rather than just ditch the whole project. I mean, I think starting to build from the ground up would be making it would be a waste, I suppose. Because once you call something art, you're able to do certain things that you're not if you call it something else.
Well, I think there's a whole issue kind of engaged within art and kind of capitalism. I mean, you get this whole capitalist realist position that Mark Fisher has sort of elaborated, where, you know, the capitalist perspective has kind of come to be the entirety of the perspective of the way that we view the world. That's the sort of operational parameters we have to work within. And in a similar way, contemporary art in its particular form of thought, but it's kind of its conceptual parameters have become the only ways in which we could kind of think of art, and any attempt to like move outside that seems to instantly get subsumed back into it. But there have been people, particularly from the accelerationist direction, you know, not just within the manifesto, but I'm thinking of like Ray Brazier's wandering abstraction, in which there's a kind of notion that we could repurpose the functions of existing sort of infrastructure and materials that are already in existence to another end. And I think maybe something like Amanda's discussion about thinking or visualizing what this other end would be if the world were otherwise starts to maybe get at that in a way.
But this is what I think the long-term project is actually, because I don't think any of us really, it's sort of why I asked the question of Amanda, like if she has a specific notion of what that otherwise is. Because for me, I feel like I'm totally on board with that, but I do not have a clear picture of that. And I think that's what that question Victoria is sort of getting at, is like, that's what needs to be established for it not just to be this sort of rethinking thing, which...
Well, Victoria adds to her point, and I should maybe Amanda, you could speak to this a little bit. According to what parameters should clarity and coherence be decided? And perhaps more importantly, if these concepts presuppose an external third object, is that object the human reception experience of the work or something else? Enrico Gomez, sorry, I think I'm reading past something, but I will pick that question up next, hopefully. Go ahead, Amanda. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that that there's ways in which I could respond to that question of what is the clarity or coherence be decided. I have to decide that in terms of my own kind of private making, and so does everyone in terms of the production of work. But I think what Victoria might be getting at is, a larger systematic project in terms of how, if we call something art, what is it? What does that name represent, and what does it? How does it produce value judgments as a kind of institution? And I think that if we, I think this is where it comes to be an actual political project and a larger collaborative project that requires a bigger shift in frameworks than. It requires artwork to be different, but I think it also requires institutional frameworks to be different, to embrace the very ideas of clarity and coherence in the first place, which are kind of tendency to be opposed in kind of recent or art as we know it discourses. And there was something about experience, but maybe Diane could add a bit to this, or...
Yeah, another question from Suhail, actually, too. I'm having a bit of trouble kind of scrolling through some of the questions right now. My browser seems to have frozen up a bit, so I'm hoping Mo could maybe post one. But anyway.
Do you want to answer Suhail's question? Because Enrico also have been waiting for a while. Do you want me to read Enrico's question?
Well, I think was Diane going to respond to something there real quick, and then maybe
yeah, okay. After Diane.
I don't even remember what I'm supposed to be responding to. No, just carry on. It's fine.
Okay, so let me just ask Enrico's question. Not for the current discussions, but rather afterward. I am interested in the transcript for today's discussion, if there should be one available. Oh, okay. I thought it was like a.
No, there was a question from Suhail though. Let me ask that to get.
Yeah, sorry.
Yeah, no, I reread that and I was like, oh, that's from okay, but we'll see about what comes of that. There will definitely be a video available.
The video will be available, right? Like, and people can watch it afterwards. So.
Yeah. Anyway, but Suhail asks, and this is for Diane, what is worth saving of art? Why persist with it? And I guess he also wonders why I would want to do that too. But maybe Diane, you could talk to that.
Oh God, don't send me down that road. I do struggle with this myself. I think, it's not. I not infrequently feel like I'm ready to indeed sort of pack it all in, and see what else comes out. But I mean, on a very practical level, there is, well, there's a couple of things that come to mind. On a very practical level, there is funding available for making works that would not necessarily be supported anywhere else. You know, I think about things like cinema. There's a whole other set of hoops one would need to jump through to get a film made. I mean, much more extensive than making an artwork. And I think the restrictions put on someone trying to make a piece of culture, you know, it's depending on what you call it, it sort of ends up in different channels, and there are different ways to actually produce a piece of culture. And I think doing it within an art context probably allows the most space for doing things, sort of for thinking through making, I guess. And I think bringing it again for me back to practice, I think for me one of the main reasons to make work is to further understand something and get my head around something. And the thing that I make in some ways is a byproduct of that process. And it's for me a way to sort of come to further understand something. And I think that way of working is supported in the art system more than other systems.
Okay.
Further,
Sorry, I don't know.
but that's the pragmatic one is the most immediate one that comes to mind.
Okay. Let me see. We got a couple other questions coming in. I don't know if you have a quick statement to respond to that, Amanda, and then Suhail wants to ask a question immediately afterwards, and then we have a question coming in from Ross Wolf.
Okay, I'll let Suhail ask his question.
Suhail, are you still there?
Yeah. Can you hear me? Can you hear me?
Suhail, go ahead.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay. So my question to Dan was earlier in the conversation. The response she's just given seemed to me to echo what Amanda was saying earlier about how art, whether you want to call it contemporary art or not, allows a space of production which one can claim as one's own, and in a way not worry about consequences or external determinations too much. But I sensed a difference earlier on where Amanda was saying she wasn't, she made work as though those external demands weren't there. So she kind of assumed the space of liberty in a way that art provides. And Dan's response just now repeated that. But what I heard Dan saying earlier was that art as a venue or a site of cultural production could be repurposed, and there seem to be some, let's call them systemic determinants rather than individual ones, that could be remobilized. Whether that's around money, around exposure, I'm not quite sure what. So I was wondering what Diane saw when she said she wasn't ready to give up on art. It didn't seem just like a personal plea that this would mean the end of her as an artist or something. It's a kind of structural condition. It seemed to be that art as a field of cultural activity, as a moneyed field, as a publicity field, and so on, but also as a site of ideas and production could provide something. But I'm wondering what the systemic elements that could be repurposed are that Diane saw.
Well, I guess I feel like this is, I mean, it's a bit of a cop-out to say this, but it's sort of yet to be defined in a way. I mean, I think this is in a way the contemporary art problem for me seems sort of like a node in a much larger problem of trying to think about a Promethean emancipatory project. So I guess I'm thinking that if through art, which sort of seems a more manageable monster than the all of everything, which is what a Promethean emancipatory project would be art being a more manageable monster, that if we can figure out some way to the infrastructure, then that could possibly be useful for the rethinking of other fields. In part because the art field is, I think, generally speaking, more receptive to, not all of it, but some of it is more receptive to the development of ideas, of new ideas, is more open to that sort of work than a lot of other things that we'll be facing if we're to take on a larger leftist transformation. I mean, art seems like a good place to start in a way because it's a somewhat, it's a more receptive audience, I guess.
Amanda, do you have anything to follow up with that, or?
Yeah, if we've got time for a second, yeah, I was mentioning earlier that kind of, I think Suhail was mentioning this too, but that, you know, is it a problem that the space that art affords me to make, like the liberty that is given to me because I'm an artist, because art can be anything, is you know, is that the red herring here, you know, or is it in fact the problem? And I was at an award ceremony a few weeks ago, and the people giving this huge award to artists were saying that they prided themselves on not being an instrumentalist kind of funding agency because they were giving artists money to do anything they wanted, and there was no pressure for them to produce any artwork or do anything. And you know, they gave a highly politicized statement about this freedom that they were granting to artists to do their work of no project, if you like, you know, because they didn't have to apply. They were awarded this grant. They were recognised and awarded it as these fellows and given 3 years worth of funding or something like that. Now, great, good, but I was really kind of bothered by this speech, and it worried me a lot. And maybe as I said in response to Suhail's question, that maybe I'm barking at the wrong tree or something like that. But what worried me about it was the amount of applause that was given, that these artists were working in the name of liberty, and that's what the whole grant was about, and that's what everybody was happy about. And it kind of, yeah, it was like this kind of fuck you to instrumentalist politics, and I could see, you know, why everybody was happy about that. But on the other hand, I was really concerned about this kind of rejoicing in the name of freedom at the level of funding. So, you know, if someone gave me the money, I would take it, and maybe that's the problem. However, the kind of systems that we see that are in place at present, they don't afford another kind of language of economic support. And this is what I was trying to wonder about before. It's something I've not thought about properly, but the distinction between money and capitalist principles is something that needs to be discussed a bit more there. And again, how I talked earlier about, like, what are the value judgments, what are the systems we're producing now, and how that kind of figure of the artist is the pre-given free subject is kind of situated within that economy or not. Now, I think changing the figure of the art, or rethinking the figure of the pre-given subjectivity of the artist is one thing, but to just merely supplant that with a kind of a figure of interdisciplinarity or a collaboration is equally as problematic ideologically, because it worries me that it would be a mere kind of semantic shift at the level of perception or in the empirical field, rather than a shift in the conceptual register of the kind of value of art and its politics. I think it's not really answering the question, but these are the kind of worries that I have about, and problems.
No, but I feel like you're asking, like, art to fix everything. Maybe, you know, do you know what I mean? It's like if you're demanding or if we're recognizing that sort of the larger system of how artists live, funding mechanisms, how one supports oneself. I mean, that sort of, I don't know. I feel like it's part of a larger system, right? So it's like we have to make it within the system we're in. You know, I mean.
Well, I think there is a kind of separation of questions here as to like, well, what is art actually doing versus like other types of thought, and maybe this is blurring those waters a bit. The kind of the way that some elements of discussion are progressed. And I mean, I think getting at maybe Sue L's question, like if art is to continue in any way, there's maybe a question of like what type of activity it is that art specifically tackles, and like how that activity will continue regardless if you get rid of the specific sort of forms of the kind of discourse that is contemporary art. And I mean, personally, I tend to think yes, there will be some sort of activity like art.
You mean just like people will make stuff no matter what, like that kind of.
Yeah. But I kind of have a question here from Ross Wolf that I wanted to pick up, and then I think we maybe got time for one more question or something like that. I think this might be for Amanda, but what would a realist art even look like now? Doesn't realism in art pose the problem of contemporary reality? If Robert Musil was correct to write in the 1930s that a kind of pseudo-reality had begun to prevail, how much more degraded is reality today?
Wow. I'm not quite sure what the problem of contemporary reality is, necessarily, as it's posed in the question, but I guess I mean, this is a really flaky response, but what is a realist art today? Well, I'm trying to address that, and you could say, well, what is a realist politics? I mean, we debate that incessantly. In order to, you know, what is a kind of politics around anti-humanist or post-humanist or non-humanist materialist thinking? What politics does it engage with? And especially when those thoughts, the thinking of realism looks to science. So what politics does the thinking through scientific method produce? What art does the thinking through scientific method produce? And all I can really say is that that's part of a practice for me, and I would be very keen on having more discussions like this about the kinds of constraints, real constraints, productive rules as to what a constructed art would be under the name of a realism. Of course, as Mo implied, as distinct from social realism. And I think, you know, that's what the kind of questioning that accelerationism asks too. At the end of the day, what I'm very much interested in is, I use the word method because I'm not really engaged with thinking this through an aesthetics or a genre or a kind of structure of art that's conditioned around certain perceptual registers, but certainly around, as I mentioned before, a kind of behavioralism. So I guess that's my attempt to kind of, you know, unfold that question towards a science, if you like.
Do you have anything to say to that, Diana? I think we have time for one more question. I believe Mo wants to ask something. So.
God, no, actually no. I feel like I do, but I'd rather just go to the next question. I'm not very clear on it. I don't have it.
Okay, Mo, I think you can go ahead then. Mo?
Yes, hi. I was hoping that I can actually, because I articulated it, and I want to like read it from my text because I think it's sort of like a question that can be addressed, right? And my question is, given the narcissistic nature of, first of all, let's just deal with this question of contemporary. As early as 1920s, people called the art of the time contemporary art, right? So there's a contemporary art with a lowercase c, which means art of the time, and then there's contemporary art with capital C, which is what Suhail and other people who address this mode of artistic production and reception have theorized as what contemporary art is. And I think maybe we can salvage the first one and sort of like question the second one, because art of our time is always going to be art of our time, and I think it's perfectly fine to call it contemporary art. But it's more like a contemporary with a lowercase c rather than the capital C. And the other question I want to ask is that given the narcissistic nature of
Amanda, I can see you.
I'm back.
Okay, yeah, me too. Is anyone else? Josh?
Yeah, I just had a server crash, so it looks
folk
like we're back.
knowledge within the larger.
Could you maybe repeat the last part of your...
You lost most of us. You got to go back.
Well, okay, so I'm saying, given the fact that art's interest is superficial in other human activities other than itself, it can almost only take itself seriously when it's doing really good work, or at least in sort of like a contemporary mode. And the kind of like knowledge that's produced by art, which is not about art, often end up being shallow, flat, and folky, like to use the sort of like the notion of folk politics, and sort of like manifest rather than scientific image. What is the place? Do we have a place for folk knowledge within a larger scheme of knowledge production? Like, is there like a need for folk knowledge that art kind of produces about other human activities, including politics? Or if we don't have any, if we don't need folk knowledge, well then what is the role of this kind of like political art or like social art or like art in which art pretends to be a scientist or anthropologist or historian or archivist or a linguist or a dancer and etc. etc. But if we do have a place for folk knowledge, then maybe we should sort of like conceptualize this role of folk knowledge, and then maybe we can understand where do these types of practices that have a superficial interest in other human activities and knowledge like sort of belong. I hope it was clear.
So you think that knowledge, if knowledge is produced through the production of art at all, is inherently folk? Is that
well, existing examples show that art's interest is superficial in this kind of field, as you see in sort of like all sorts of ready-made practices like relational aesthetics, social practice, like all sorts of like all sorts of schemas in which artists are like suddenly interested in like a practice outside of the art world and try to bring it in, whether it could even be political art, right? Interested in larger stuff outside of the art world. So I'm trying to make a case maybe for folk knowledge, which art then can be argued that like, yes, these types of surface knowledges are needed. So I want to see if you guys think there's a need for that, because I think in a conversation with Joshua kind of arguing that like, well, maybe there is some place for it.
for folk knowledge?
Yeah, like folk and like kind of like surface knowledge, you know, like knowledge that is like just like shallow.
I don't.
As long as it's aware of it, I think.
Quite what I was arguing, Mo, but I guess I'll see if I mean I think the question is more whether or not the type of knowledge, I don't know if that's quite the right word for art, is that the type of ways that art or aesthetic practice can sort of represent, which is generally somewhat phenomenological and embodied in nature. And I guess that does have this sort of like folk characteristic in that it's not, you know, the sort of mediated knowledge of say, like science or something like that, which usually goes through these various like apparatuses, either expressed.
No, but I'm also addressing it on a level of research, man. On the level of research, artist interest is kind of superficial. Not only in the way it ends up being sort of like communicated to the audience, which is like, as you rightfully said, phenomenological and embodied. But like the type of research practices that artists do is kind of like shallow, and it's for sort of like, it's not as rigorous as like when an artist shows, when Mark Dion shows an interest in archival, it's very shallow. When, you know what I mean? But I'm trying to say, well, what he produces, I just used an example. What he produces, would it still be, should we reject that because it's sort of like, because the research was kind of shallow with that, and it made some sort of like a folk knowledge about how archives function. We have archivists that can tell us a lot more rigorously about how archives function. But do we need that type of folk knowledge produced with some sort of like a superficial interest in an external activity? And if we do, where is this place?
Well, I don't necessarily want to dominate this. I think, I mean, I think there's a question of whether or not the type of activity that somebody like Dion is trying to do, although I don't think maybe I would necessarily agree or endorse his particular practice, but there's a question of whether or not it is actually to function just as an archive, or if it's meant to have this more negative register of kind of questioning how archives function.
I think we can maybe ask that from the participating artists, what they think.
Yeah, no, I would love to hear what Amanda and Diane have to say to that.
I'm still trying to get my head around whether I agree with you that all research artists do is superficial. So I'm kind of stuck on that. I mean, I suppose it's superficial as to, I mean, for the purposes of these other fields, but not necessarily for art, if you see what I mean. So, like, you know, he's doing research on archives, and you take any archivist, and they could give you, you know, a more succinct account that may be true, but the archivist could then not think about what the archive's relationship is to art, or to the visual, or to other things that art might do. So I don't know if there's, I mean, I think thinking of art as purely engaged in, or as purely as a folk knowledge seems depressing and limiting, and you know, I mean, in a way, I feel like for myself, I feel like it's the thing I'm trying to get out of. I mean, I think that's the thing that I often find myself.
But can that acknowledgement be? Can that acknowledgement not be in a way liberating too, where you acknowledge that what you're doing is what you just said? You know what I mean? Like, what I do is different than what an actual archivist does. So sure, maybe on a scientific scale, my engagement is superficial, but it serves a different purpose. So that's sort of like, I just use words like folk knowledge to kind of like give it like a label, but we could call it whatever. But with that particular type of knowledge that is resulted from that particular type of artist engaging with fields of knowledge outside of the field of, say, art and art history.
I'm reluctant around this folk thing, because it sort of sounds like what you're saying, that any discipline is inherently folk because it's involved in itself as a discipline, and its focus is its own discipline. So I'm resistant to the folk thing because of the other connotations it has as sort of a localism, and which I understand why you would make that claim, but it sort of feels like then you sort of take that brush and put it over everything, that everything is inherently folk because it only can speak to its own field. And that.
But that's not what I said, actually. But that's okay. But that's not what I said, because I said when art talks about anything but itself, it kind of like its engagement can only be superficial. But art usually has a very deep understanding of it. Art is actually one field they understand really well is the world of art and the history of contemporary art, history of where the practice belong, and what all artists, thanks to the internet especially, what all other practitioners are doing. So they actually have a very good understanding of their own field. Their relationship with their own field is not folk at all. It's very rigorous and professional. It's when they get out to do something outside of their own field that I think sometimes more often than sometimes their engagement is sort of like shallow.
But art is often. I mean, it just feels like you're limiting art should be about art, and that just seems really dull. I don't know. I mean, it's like if I went to go see like a movie about movie making, it'd be like, you know, I would much rather see like, I don't know, some stupid sci-fi thing where, I don't know, I saw one last week. It was great, but it was not about filmmaking. You know, I mean, there's, you know, you can watch a film in the cinema and you can see, you know, you can think about how films are made, and you can think about devices that are used. You can think about cinema and the history of cinema, but the film isn't about cinema. You know.
I was wondering if Amanda maybe had something to add to that.
Yeah, I was going to say that I empathise or sympathise at least with Mo's point, but I do see, you know, what Diane's saying here is that the risk of saying that art does one thing well or a couple of things well, and one of them is to talk about itself, is precisely my complaint, is that art is really misunderstood itself, or misunderstood the kind of operations of language, which is what it's constituted by, and it's misunderstood the conditions of mediation, which is how it operates. And I think that, you know, my worry here is that, you know, arts, what Mo might call arts professionalism, is basically to say we're autonomous because we talk about ourselves all the time to make ourselves believe in this folk culture of art spontaneous philosophy, to invest its faith in its autonomy, if you like, which makes art believe that it's actually not reliant upon the conditions of capitalism, which mark out and set out its value in the market, that is, you know, and also morally. And I think that, you know, arts, I keep using this word professionalism because I was like, I heard that, what Mo was saying, but arts professionalism, therefore, is just a hubristic kind of look at itself. Whether it sees itself as succeeding or failing, it's still doing the same thing. It's the self-consciousness. Now, I guess what I'm more interested in is what is a kind of conscious practice rather than a self-conscious practice, and that kind of understands that art is using representations, for example, rather than it can choose to not represent, as some people would have it, you know, like Hito Still, for example, and lots of other people interested in phenomenology. So I guess, yeah, that's a really important kind of question for me about, you know, taking the term from Althusser, obviously the spontaneous philosophy of not only scientists but artists. And I do think that often, you know, artists do use different discourses and disciplines in a very weak sense in the name of labour or research, and therefore fulfill a kind of post-Fordist economic model of the working artist, of the artist who cares and so on, or who thinks. You know, these are kind of quite advantageous positions to develop as an artistic identity, as we've seen. But I think there is a distinction to be made between artists who do that kind of, like, say, I will be an anthropologist now, or you know, it's like Mr. Ben kind of style art, where today I'll be a magician, and the next day I'll be, you know, transgender or something. So I think there's a difference between that kind of play with identities to the idea of art doing, like art operating with its own task or its own research or its own, like, meaningful labour, let's call it, for the sake of this discussion. And, you know, in terms of Mark Dion, you know, I'm not going to go one way or another, but, you know, you could sit and read that practice and say, well, what does it tell me? Does it tell me that people are really interesting if we look a bit closer? You know, what is it kind of communicating to me? Is it communicating to me something about the idiosyncrasy of the artist himself? What are the narratives that are kind of hovering like in the practice that kind of allow me to read it in particular ways? And then, you know, if there's a practice that, whatever practice, whether it uses other discourses or not, or other disciplines, I don't think it's the kind of it's not the kind of formal constitution of the work that bothers me in that sense, i.e., is it going outside of its practice or not? It's something kind of much more indebted to the behaviour of the practice and the principles that it seems to advocate in when we read it as an audience. And also how it's been marketed and distributed by the gallery or the whoever, the collector or whatever. All of those conditions around the work make something happen.
I think I'm getting a couple messages, but I unfortunately can't see them because that part of my screen has seemed to be frozen. I do think we should be wrapping up here pretty soon. I think we're into
do you see the question that? Do you see the last question that Tom has asked?
I'm going to read that, Mo, and then can we wrap up with that?
Do you want to read it?
I can't read it. I can't see it.
Okay, so maybe I should read it. I apologize for like doing it instead of you, but like it's Tom McLean. He's a New York-based artist who asks, does a sense of or will towards acceleration track with a determinist ideal of progress, albeit faster, or with a sense of uncontrollability and or lack of rationality within which their leakage of pneumatic fluid that can then actually counteract the determinist ideal of progress. Beach's caution against nostalgia, avant-garde, modernism, futurism is appropriate here, as is her suspicion of a too knowing of the parameters. Witness the implosion of much postmodernist theory. But what about an argument toward pushing the machinic metaphor past its signifying task as calibrator of RPMs? This is the last question. Can we ask it? So I guess it's about sort of like endorsing what Amanda was saying and proposing. Maybe I should just read the last part of it again.
Seems a little Landian if I'm hearing the last part right, but...
What about a machinic metaphor past its signifying task as a calibrator of RPMs?
was that motorcycle outside? So is that part of the question?
We need to end on sound effects each time, I think. Yeah. Do either of you have anything to say to that, or? And then I think we'll wrap it up.
I would just like a conversation with this person, Tom McGlynn. I need to know more, really. I don't feel like I could answer that coherently, or give it a due answer that it requires, because I'd want to know more about the machinic metaphor. I'd want to know more about the kind of idea about art and its relationship to metaphor, and how a metaphor calibrates. So I have kind of questions, and I would welcome another discussion around that, but I don't feel like I can answer it coherently just from the quick question there.
Okay, Diane, anything to add, or shall we call it?
I kind of have a similar response. I'm always slightly nervous around the acceleration and speed equivalence, and I'm not sure that's what the question's doing, but yeah, I guess I feel too that I would need more padding out of the question, really. I mean, yeah, if he responds now with elaboration on the machinic metaphor, maybe we could, but I don't know if it's too late. It's 2 hours.
We're already at 5 p.m. I think hopefully maybe Tom would be able to develop that thought in some other direction, and we could kind of maybe address it at some future time. Anyway, I want to thank you both for being here with us today, and thank Jason from GCAS for helping to set this up technically and everything. And yeah, I think that's it.
Thank you as well. It was
Everybody
really
for their
great.
questions.
Thanks a lot. Thanks for setting it up.
All right. Well, have a good day. Bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.